Welcome! I am the Munshin King of the Century. This is my review of Swamp Thing, Episode 1, which I only watched today. It's been out since the end of May, I believe, May the 31st. But it took my time, but it was worth the glory because I enjoyed this for sure. However, I'll go into some details for you. Swamp Thing follows Dr. Abby Arcane as she investigates what seems to be a deadly swamp-borne virus in a small town in Louisiana, but soon discovers that the swamp holds mystical and terrifying secrets. When a mysterious creature emerges from the murky marsh, she finds herself facing the nightmares of a supernatural world where no one is safe. Now, this was the pilot episode, the introduction to our world, to our characters, to our monster and our crimes. Abby Arcane, played by Crystal Reed, investigates a deadly virus in the swamps of Louisiana and finds a mysterious creature in the series premiere. Now, I have to tell you, I don't know a lot about Swamp Thing. I know he's from DC Comics. He is a character. I don't know how long he's been in the comics, whether 50 years, 100 years, or 20. I do not know that information. And the only exposure to his character I have been witness to so far is in the movie Justice League Dark, which was an animated movie with Batman. Quite a fantasy movie. There was magic.
Are you talking about magic?
We've come up against magic before, Batman.
There were ghouls. There was something to do with Merlin and some evil warlord. I think there was even deathly spirits.
Who's he talking to now?
Shrouds. They deliver souls to hell.
But that movie had the Swamp Thing. I believe the Justice League all turned into zombies or something, but there was the Swamp Thing that they asked for help from. And I was under the impression he was neither good nor evil in terms of human interpretation. I thought he merely was a protector, a guardian of nature and the environment. I thought he really was supposed to encompass the looking after our planet sort of message, a duty to uphold the natural order of things.
For who destroys more green than your kind?
And very against human intervention. He didn't have a huge part in that movie, but we definitely saw him kick some action up the butt, so to speak.
The defender of the green.
Crazy scenes, crazy powers this Swamp Thing showed in that movie. Extraordinary scenes! In this introduction, it really starts off like a classic monster movie. It doesn't show you everything to begin with. It isn't over the top. Well, it is in a way, but it's not to the extent that I saw in the animation. So I was very actually impressed by the beginning, how it starts off. It's not that unique. The setup is quite simple, quite classic. You have these guys on a boat going into or through the swamp, and they get attacked by the thing. And I'm telling you, it was very spooky introduction. It seemed much more sinister than I thought this would be. I didn't look at the rating or anything beforehand, but I got chills almost watching it. It was a very good build-up, a very good setup. You know, the classic rule of movie making, I hear. It's scarier when you don't see the monster, when they're kept in the shadows, when they're teased, and when you don't just play all your cards right away. You don't just put them out into the open from the very beginning. This way it builds suspense, and this really was quite well executed suspense. It really set quite a dark tone, I must say. I was watching it lonely, and I was afraid I would cry, and I would scratch my eyes for the pain of the universe. However, very well done to you. It was funny, one of the guys in the boat, because the boat was getting knocked, and one of the men said, that was just a gator, right? Meaning an alligator. As if an alligator around your little boat would be a more desirable option. Oh, it was quite gory. They get knocked off the boat, and one of them, it was quite a spectacular visual we see. All of these vines, like wooden, I'm not sure the right word, but we see sort of these like tentacles merging together, entwining together to create something much bigger, and they killed the guy going right through his body, and it is quite a monument. This is payback! And it was much more gory than I expected. I didn't expect this to be to this extent. It wasn't too bad, but for younger viewers it would be quite gruesome for sure, and I really like that aspect, but very spooky. That was actually unexpected because, as I said earlier, I did not think he was a villain. I did not see Swamp Thing as a villain going into this. I just saw him as a protector of the environment. But here, seeing him just murder, I'm calling it a him, even though we don't see a him. We just see these sort of entrails, these tentacles of wood or moss attacking, squirming around. But when I saw that the guy got murdered, I thought, this is darker than I thought. This is interesting, but also I'm not sure how are we supposed to support this monster, or are we supposed to be against it? Which I suppose is the point of any sort of good villain, but also a good message in terms of the environment. What is the balance? But right away, we don't know who these guys are either. We just see them following some GPS coordinates on their iPad, and they're in the swamp at night. And then one of them escapes almost, and he goes to shore, and we see that he's looking at something above. Really shot well, as I said. And then we cut to our main character, I suppose, our protagonist, and she's working in some, I think it was the Congo, and she was over there to as a medical doctor or something in that field, because they were helping people who were sick with some disease. And then she gets transferred, or she accepts a job in Louisiana, where our swamp is located.
Nicole, there's a situation back in the States.
Where? You're kidding.
So she's taken here because we see a girl. There is a girl in a classroom who had a nosebleed and then fainted, but her green stuff was coming from her. Very gooey. And so when she arrives, it is discovered there is a plague or something that is starting out, and it is spreading to people. But we don't actually see anyone infected except for two people, and that is the girl and her father. Now, her father, it turns out, suffered a great deal worse than the girl, because the girl she was relatively fine in hospital, and but it was discovered there was a leaf on her bed. Our character discovered this leaf and was very curious to discover where it came from. And she visited the father's home.
To find the source of this disease.
And this father was one of the fishermen, the one who we saw at the end, who swam ashore. But it turns out the father was a gruesome thing. We found him in his bathroom, and it was really great effect. We saw he was sort of turned into some plant, sort of, I want to say statue. He was frozen in place. There was wooden things coming out of his mouth, as if he was vomiting it out. And he was entwined with all of these moss, this green plantation and wooden plantation, and it was a very good effect. Overall, the effects were very interesting visually. At the beginning, I wasn't so sure with just the twines going up in the swamp. I thought it was alright, not the best, but it wasn't distracting either, which was good. But later on, when we saw some of the more over-the-top stuff, it really looked very terrific. We saw the father come to life in one scene. They thought he was dead, and I suppose he was dead. But there was this other biologist who meets up with our main character, and he was analyzing the swamp, and he came across some samples. And when applied these samples from the swamp, this water, it turned ordinary moss wild. It turned it crazy. I think it was some mutagen accelerant, and it turned the plants and made them expand, and it made them multiply, and it was a crazy scene. But when he applied it to the sample from the dead man, the father came to life, and tentacles sprouted from his body, and it multiplied 1,000 times in the lab. And that was a great effect, because we saw this ghoulish plant figure. It all reminded me a bit of Poison Ivy from the Batman. Some sort of crazy experiment that she would concoct. Very like her minions or something. But this was really quite creepy. It was funny, I thought, because his daughter woke up, and somehow she screamed, "Daddy!" and then fainted. And I just thought to myself, how is it possible that she even recognized her father in that state? Because he looked completely unrecognizable. He was basically a plant creature at that point, with sort of a human. I mean, his body was sort of there, but at one point it sort of came into, and it was like a zombie plant, is a good way to describe it, with tentacles flying all over the place. I thought the acting was a bit odd in places, because the biologist, the man she meets up with, who has the samples from the swamp, I don't know, he just seemed a bit dull at parts.
Dealt with anything like that before?
Who are you again?
Holland.
He seemed like he wasn't very expressive emotionally. And the woman also was she seemed a bit cheery.
My name is Dr. Abby Arcane. My team is here to find the source of this disease.
After going to the father's house and seeing that crazy, scene of the father frozen with plants flying out of his body, she just seemed a bit too relaxed and cheery at what she was seeing. She was smiling at the guy, and it was a bit odd, I will put it like that. But she seemed a bit more engaging than the man, if I'm honest. As I said, he was a bit... I got used to him, but certainly at points he seemed a bit... both of them, they didn't seem like this is how you would react to these situations. Smiling and joking, and really, she seemed quite cheery to me. She said she doesn't like mysteries, she likes solutions, so you would think this would be her worst nightmare, with these unexplainable things from a fantasy sci-fi movie or comic book, and yet no answer. They're at the lab and they can't find the pathogen or something, and there's a girl in trouble, and there's the town potentially in danger of an epidemic, and they just seemed a bit too cool about things. They didn't seem very like it was the end of all things as they know it, as it rightly should be. It just seemed a bit calm. And I thought it was odd. She has never met this man before, who was found digging at the house initially. Initially he was snooping around the lab, and then he was told to leave, and then her and the sheriff found him in the father's home. He was looking for a sample. But this is a man she's never met before, knows nothing about, and she decides to go with him alone in a tiny boat to the swamp with no one else there. The strange man going to a strange swamp where might not be the safest place in the world. And in fact, later on, they do the same thing. After finding out that 3 fishermen went to the swamp alone at night and never came back, they decided to go on their own to investigate. Things like that don't really make a lot of sense, even though I suppose that's a trope of these sorts of mysteries, detectives sort of. Even though they're not detectives, they're just sort of scientists, I guess. It's sort of a trope that people just go off and investigate things on their own without telling anyone, without really much concern for their safety. In detective movies or series where they go chasing after the murderer, investigating things all on their own. It reminded me of that. They know things are not right. They know there is danger, and still they do things like that. But it got quite cartoony at one point, because the whole town, the town is in the town hall, and they're, doing the classic complaining that they do against the people in charge.
We don't know what this is yet. The hospital is on it 24/7, and the CDC.
And the tone quite shifted for me because it felt like a Stephen King story, because the town people already were saying, it's the swamp fighting back! The swamp has had enough! So it felt unreal. It felt like it wasn't taking place in a real world, in a real setting that we know on Earth, because it felt already like a supernatural belief in supernatural, in something beyond. There was an old man who was saying, the swamp is a part of our heritage, our way of life. We all know there's something different about this town.
Something special about this place.
So it felt like a Stephen King horror sort of book where it's not a normal town and not normal people. Like in It, for example, there's sort of this feeling that all the adults know something is happening. They know something is not quite right, but they don't really say it aloud, or they just get on with their lives. But this old man seems to be a significant character because he was doing laboratory. He's a rich dude, and he seems to be responsible for some laboratory experiments. He was suggesting they might find some medicine from the swamp, some fertilizers. He wanted to explore what secrets it holds. And there were angry townspeople complaining about, this is revenge. The swamp is having revenge for toxic waste into the swamp, for burning the trees. So that sort of solidified that this was an environmental based character. But it was interesting that they had that belief in, like, the swamp was sacred or spiritual, important to the people in this town. The whole thing about the body they'd found, I thought it was a bit odd, because it never gets leaked to the press or anything. I mean, I'm guessing this is a small town, but nonetheless, the sheriff found the body, and I'm guessing everyone knows they were at the town complaining about this bug, this disease, and yet we don't see anyone else apart from the girl and the father with the disease. And I just thought no one was really paying attention to the body of this father. No one was really, like, press involved, anyone reporting what was going on there. Because I think the father was a unique case, because he had direct contact with the thing, whereas I'm not sure how it passed on to the daughter. Well, she lives in the same house as the man, but in terms of everyone else in the town, I did no clue how it passed on to them. Because, okay, it makes some sense, he went home and it passed to the daughter somehow, but how did it pass to everyone else in the town? I don't know. Unless the daughter passed it to the classmates, possibly, but we don't see that. We just hear that it's spreading without any visual to that. So eventually, as I said, the woman and the man, the biologist and the scientist, they go out alone to the swamp at night, and they discovered the monument that was created in the introduction, the place where the fishermen got attacked.
This is payback!
Well, I don't think they were fishermen. They were there on a job. They were hired to plant things in the water, it turned out. And what they were planting in the water turned out to be the pathogen, not the accelerant of the mutagen, which was apparently making this happening, I think. I think that was implied, that they were putting these boxes in the water, and this was making these things go at a faster rate. They were affecting the swamp in this way. And they go back to the guy's house, and there is quite a bit of backstory actually. It did very well in keeping us intrigued throughout, because there are some slow moments, but I was never bored watching this. It kept my attention all the way through, and it did a good job of putting in some backstory here and there. For example, the man had a backstory of fabricating evidence for his research. Even though he knew the conclusion was right, he couldn't replicate the results, and so he was shamed. He was found out, and then he ended up working for the old guy in the town hall, who told him to do some scientific investigation into the swamp. And yet when the biologist tells him there's a link between the swamp and this disease, he doesn't really want to hear about it. He doubts it, and he doesn't want there to be a panic. So maybe he's covering something up, or maybe he is just negligent. But certainly there are other forces at work, because when the man goes back to the swamp, because there was a laptop he retrieved, the GPS locations, and he wanted to go back to fish out all of these boxes out the water that had been put there by the men.
Alcon was investigating illegal dumping on the swamp.
However, at the end of the episode, we see him get shot. There's another boat that comes along, and he gets shot in the chest. I think he gets shot multiple times. And what's more, the guy has a crossbar with a fire detonator or something, and then blows up the boat.
Hello?
The man falls in the water. It was pretty hard to believe he survived it, but he managed to swim to shore, and it very well mirrored what happened at the beginning with the guy who swam to shore. And he gets encased with the plants, which are alive at this point, and they encase him, and they surround him, they wrap him up, and then he gets pulled underwater more. And I was thinking, why doesn't the swamp thing attack the man who attacked the boat? Because I'm assuming the man who blew up the boat was one of the men who or part of the organization that was planting these in the water, and the swamp thing had no problem attacking them at the beginning, but it didn't attack the man who came and shot the man, our biologist. So things like that aren't really coherent, don't really add up, because why did he leave these both guys alone and attack the people at the beginning? But nonetheless, the woman sees the explosion and comes on her own, in her own boat. I don't know how many boats there are, but they seem to be on hand, fairly accessible. And she gets attacked by the swamp thing. It chases her. And when I say the swamp thing, I mean we just see the tentacles chasing her. These tendrils of wood and green moss. It's hard to explain what they are, but the tentacles seems like the most appropriate. And they come at her. She runs off. But we see the reveal at the end. We never saw it in this form before, but we see it come out of the water. This green, mossy creature. This thing. And it's in sort of a man form. It's, 2 legs, 2 arms, sort of humanoid form at last. And it was my assumption that this was the man we just saw, the biologist, because it would be a great shame if he just left the story at this point. So we see the reveal of the creature at last, and it looked good. It looked, I think, very effective. It had red eyes as well. But I think it was that biologist who was shot and fell into the water. But I'm on two minds about it, because I don't think he's dead. If he died, then that was just a waste of character, and there was no point trying to build that connection with him and her. I very much believe that is the guy. But then it makes me wonder, because at the beginning, the person who fell in the water clearly looked up at something, as if it was, a form. When that happened, I imagined he was looking at the humanoid form of the Swamp Thing. The actual, more physical creature, shaped. In which case, who was that then? So I'm thinking maybe he will... Either the man is dead, or the plants sort of possess his body, maybe. You just use his body for the form. But I think that would be a bit underwhelming if we didn't see the biologist have his own conscience, still be alive in some form. But we'll find out in the next episode. As I say, I don't know about Swamp Thing, his origin, how it was created. So it is all new to me, but I very thoroughly enjoyed this episode. There was some gory moments which I liked. There was like a tentacle coming out of a guy's eye. There was... It wasn't, cartoony looking. It looked realistic. The girl was quite likable, even though she smiled quite a lot during these sort of horrific, or after and preceding these horrific events. It didn't make sense when she saw this great sort of towering construction that the Swamp Thing created, going, "This is impossible! How is this possible?" Because this was after the scene in the laboratory where the dead man came alive and tentacles were spreading all over the place. That was after that scene, and then she was going, "How is this possible?" So by that point you would think this shouldn't be so unbelievable for her, but it was odd no one called the police when the dead guy came back alive, because it was just in the other room. The woman took the girl who fainted in the other room to resuscitate her, but no one called the police right away. Things like that are a bit odd. And also they are not people who do autopsies, and yet they had the body. So it just seemed odd there was just those two people who had been allowed to deal with this body. You would think they would have to alert some higher authorities, or the FBI. I don't know who would deal with something like this, but it just seemed very odd that in this room we just had this one woman and this one man, and there wasn't really security around. There wasn't, a whole team looking at this body, this crazy, miraculous, spooky, devastatingly impactful discovery. And they weren't even covered wearing masks or anything. It was funny because at the beginning she demanded the team who was working on the girl to wear face masks and wear bodysuits, but we have this creature covered in plants, and who was really the most sick version of this disease we've seen, and yet they weren't protected at all. And they seem to have no safety measures in that situation. But overall, it was a great start to this season, to this series. I believe it's got 10 episodes, so I'm a tenth of the way through. Great start. There was also this backstory with the woman and the wife of the old man. The old man's rich. I think he has prominence in this town. But the woman has some really big beef with the girl because her daughter died, and she blames our main character for that. I don't remember her name. I don't remember the guy's name, but she blames her for her daughter's death, and she was sort of threatening her if she didn't save this little girl from the disease. And then she made her promise that she would save the little girl. And then she said once she saves the girl, she has to leave. She wants her gone from the town. Which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because she said she was letting her stay because she would be helpful. And yet, if there's more people infected, I think she would be useful still, even after the girl. But later on, the woman says to the biologist that she killed the girl. And I think that might have just been a melodramatic way of saying it was her fault she died. I don't think she murdered her. I don't think she deliberately killed her. But it's interesting because they didn't answer what exactly happened there. So I'm sure that will be uncovered in the next episodes. But that woman definitely has a big grudge against her for not saving her daughter, and it will be interesting how their relationship, their adversary develops, and it will be interesting to see what occurs in the next episode. So I would definitely recommend this if you have not yet watched it. I had a good time. I hope you will too. My first introduction to the Swamp Thing, and I'm looking forward for more. But tell me your thoughts, show me your crimes, and remember, jump on that subscribe button if you would like to eat the cheese. Farewell, my munchins. Take care, my munchins. Ah!
Thank you.